Should you or shouldn't you eat pork? Some people say that they don't feel well when they're eating pork. Others say that they thrive when they're eating pork. So, what's actually going on here? Harry has a very sensible explanation to what seems to be a forever ongoing discussion about what meats are the best for us humans to consume. I think you're gonna like this one. But when we've talked before, you did mention that, like, most people think that the Mediterranean diet is just olive oil, vegetables, fish, but it isn't actually traditionally like that. There's a lot more meat in the diet, especially pork. And the thing with pork is that I often hear people say that they don't do very well with pork and they do a lot better with ruminant meats. So, how come a diet that has traditionally been very rich in pork has done really well for a whole population of people, but there's so many individuals that don't do well with that diet?
Well, if you look at pork traditionally, um, pork is even pork that is actually consuming some grains will still have lower deuterium levels than beef. The pork has got the capacity to detox far better than most other animals, and because it lives in its own filth, but also it has the capacity to also deuterium deplete far more than any other animal. So it's quite tolerant. This is why the deuterium levels in pork, even the ones that are grain fed, are only a few parts per million difference. It's very little. So maybe 118 rather than 115. And bacon is 113. And if it's heavily grain fed, it'll be 115. That's low, guys. Where tallow is in the 118, 119, and all that is already higher than even the grain fed pig. And then once it's actually eating grains, it'll be, way into the 120 odd. And so will all the dairy products and all that are coming from a grain based eating as well for those animals. So it's quite clearly that it's got far better capacity in that regard. And if you take a look at most of the so-called longevity areas that are touted, their main meat is pork, except down in Costa Rica, in the Nagoya Peninsula, they're all cowboys and it's beef based pretty much. So, because it's an arid sort of environment, there's only some fruit trees that are seasonal. The rest of it's like that. Before any road was actually built into the peninsula, the people just ate a few seasonal things, very little. It was primarily dairy and meats and stuff like that. They didn't even consume any fish or anything like that. So it's very much a ruminant-based diet. But all the others, you go to Okinawa, they've got an old saying, we start the day with pork and we end the day with pork. Now, also, they time restricted their feeding and they also limit to 80%. So they don't eat and they don't have any snacks in between. But traditionally, we're talking about modern kids. That's a different thing altogether, like all modern kids. Youngsters that have grown into the sad diet culture. But when it comes to those traditional people, you don't find, like in Ikaria, in the coastal areas, there are no very few, if any, centenarians. They're all up in the mountains. It's the same thing in Greece. Mainland Greece are all up in the mountains. It's the same thing in the mountains of Italy. It's the same thing in the mountains of Sardinia. They're all pastoral and they pretty much consume. I mean, my father used to lard with his mother because he was one of the twin eldest son, and help his mother with larding. That's before olive oil existed. That was the fat that people used in the mountains. And even in the lowlands, they had pigs, and that was the main fat that they used for themselves. Olive oil was adopted after the Second World War due to the Marshall Plan, the Americans coming in. Greece was devastated after the Second World War, and they invested heavily in oils because it was easy to produce them more rapidly than rebuild a lot of the animal stocks that had been decimated and, well, largely as the Axis forces were withdrawing from Greece, they took all the animals with them. So that sort of exacerbated the existing starvation in Greece as well, made things worse. And so the only things that could quickly be brought in was oils and grains at the time. And that's when Ansel Keys and all these other people were sort of turned up at a period of when, beyond the Lent, there was also pretty much very low animal stocks and all that. We Greeks love. We've actually, like our traditional restaurant is called a psistaria. That's what our traditional restaurant is called. It's not called a restaurant or anything like that. It's called a psistaria. And a psistaria means a gorilla. That means we love grilled meat. I mean, it's just crazy that the most popular type of restaurant in Greece to this day, even back in the 70s, it was the same thing, right through to today is a psistaria. And people have this delusion that it's non-meat based. I'm going, you guys live in another world, in the, your little academic, airy-fairy world, and have no idea what people really eat in different countries. You just make-believe stuff. And as Mary Ruddock, when she actually looked at the actual study, because she was a vegetarian before she started going low carbon, now a bit more animal based. And she went to Ikaria believing that she'd find these people eating all these vegetables and living long and all that. And she went to the mountains and realized it was all basically pastoral people with animals. Dairy and meat was the main thing, and organ meats. Some old granny in some village restaurant was cooking organ meats for the day and stuff like that. What the hell's going on here? What sort of plant-based diet are they talking about? And
Yeah.
then she went back and looked at the research and actually found that the actual research paper, when the Harvard University had sent it to the Athens University to get translated into Greek, it got translated. One component of it is the thing meat. Now, meat in Greece, when we say meat, kreas, we mean beef, only beef. All the other meats, we actually call them by their name. It's a funny, peculiar Greek thing, I know, but that's what it is. So if you don't understand the culture, how things get translated and understood, because when I say kreas to somebody, they always say, yeah, kamia fora. Sometimes I'll actually have kreas, which means sometimes I'll have beef. But I say most of the time I have lamb and pork and stuff like that, because we get like pork on the skewer. That's the sort of favourite souvlaki that many people consume in Greece. And as a youngster, I used to go and get 2 or 3 souvlaki, like skewered pork on a stick, and that was pretty much my lunch. Used to ride with my bicycle, there was a local place a bit further down from my place, and grab 3 of those, go and eat them, and then go and play with my friends.
Yeah,
So, I mean,
I'm jealous. That
it's
sounds delicious.
yeah, it's ridiculous, the sort of stuff that you hear from people, and I go, I never had that experience. I lived in Greece as a youngster all my teenage years for 6 years. I just had started high school in Australia, and I left and went to Greece and completed my education, my high school education there, before I came back to Australia when I was 18. So I lived through nearly 6 years in Greece. In the 70s, when you didn't have a lot of, there were still all the local shops. They're all Greek. There were very few supermarkets and very not as much processed stuff. So even in the 70s, the diet was heavily animal based, like dairy and meat. Primarily, like lamb's yogurt in the morning. I mean, yes, we ate bread. It was actually sourdough, but it was a variety similar to Zea, which has very low gluten. Zea practically is considered nearly a gluten-free bread, but that's the ancient variety. It's a variety of that. In some parts of Greece, they still produce the Zea bread, the old one, which has pretty much zero gluten, more or less. The traditional stews, even in Europe, that's how they were. They had some vegetables and a whole lot of meats and stuff like that. And they were using dairy products and stuff like that. It's a traditional way that people did. Now, getting back, yes, to that, I think that an exposure to certain types of meats over a very, very long period of time will actually affect sort of adaptation to those sources of meats, how people do and all that. And because they're going to have a different fatty acid profile, this is me hypothesizing how
Okay.
I've worked it out. And because there's no research, this is just me hypothesizing that I believe that you will get different types of genes that will be upregulated in order to deal with the different fatty acid and amino acid composition of the different foods, the animal foods as well. And how have I come to this realization? I've come to this realization because I look at people like in Asia as well, like some Chinese friends that come from the north. They do far better on beef than they do on pork. And the ones from the south do far better on pork than they do on beef. And they prefer it as well. Like me, my favorite food is lamb and pork, and I don't really like beef, to be honest. I know it's heresy within this carnivore community, but I do not like beef as much. But I actually feel better when I'm doing pork and lamb. I feel much better. but I'm doing beef, I don't feel as good or energized. And I noticed that also with the Chinese people from the north and the south, because in the north, horse meat and horse dairy were the key foods that Mongols and northern Chinese consumed, where southern Chinese are less dairy based, are more pork based, chicken, fish, things like that, both river fish and non-river fish, coastal fish. And they seem to do much better at consuming those sort of foods. I also find that I do also much better having a bit of seafood in. And that's probably because of the Greek component where consumed a certain level, not a lot, but a certain level of coastal fish and stuff like that. So I'll buy some sardines and things like that occasionally and some crustaceans. So that's the sort of way I consume and the sort of way traditionally people would have consumed in the types of meats in the Mediterranean. It would have been those sort of type of animals. So it is quite interesting how people, based on their ancestral, like in Northern Europe, they do way better with things like beef and stuff like that. People thrive who have come from that background, and they tend to have certain level of what they describe as sensitivity. But I've actually asked them to go on, can you do a test? And they go, well, nothing really came up in the test. I just don't feel as good as when. And it may just be, if it's not inflammatory, then what is it? And the only thing that I can think of is a genetic adaptation to be able to transcript enzymes to be able to deal with the different composition of that food. I know it's very much a speculative and way out there sort of concept of adaptation to animal foods, but I sort of got that from. I'll sort of explain how I came about. I was watching a video of Anthony Shaffer, and he was actually talking about how animals having specialize on different plant foods, and they can actually they've developed the enzymes to process this type of plant food, but not that other type of plant food. And so, if you give an animal a plant that they've not tolerated to or have the ability to transcript enzymes to break down the anti-nutrients and deal with it and extract the nutrition from that, then it could be toxic to them, even another plant. And I'm going, maybe there's something similar. I extrapolated myself. Maybe something similar is happening with humans. We have not investigated it, where these prolonged adaptations to a certain type of food supply that you would be exposed to, living in a certain environment, may also be at play on the animal side of foods, no different than dairy tolerance and, all these other things, crustacean tolerance. Some people can tolerate them, some people can't. And it may be because we've developed the right shifts in genetics to be able to create the right enzymatic component machinery to deal with those. And I can tolerate oysters and somebody else can't, as an example. And I do much better on those things. And from that sort of extrapolation, I've come to the conclusion that there is possibly a basis. So I came from that basis. I always thought that there was, from all my anecdotal experience. And then when I saw Anthony's sort of approach on the thing, I said, it sort of gave me a bit more, you could say, confirmation that maybe the same thing is what I thought is happening on the animal side is just the something equivalent, that species that are specialized on certain animal foods. I mean, I know humans generally are considered generalists. Maybe we're not as generalists as people think, and maybe there are some adaptations to specifically doing things over a very long period of time. It makes logical sense if we can develop an adaptation and change, when we're exposed to like the Irish and the people in the Hebrides and people in the actual Scotland there, to different, retinol-based intakes and, beta-carotene being down-regulated and stuff like that, and people, having certain adaptation to different type of dairy types as well, and even the casein types may, some people can tolerate better casein 1 than casein 2 and, the casein 1. where some can't, and all these sort of variability. And it may be because that person has the enzymes to deal with that and the other person doesn't.
Mm.
And so there are adaptations and inherited adaptations over time. It makes more sense why we notice this variability within people within the carnivore space. And people say, I do better with eating this sort of stuff and all that. And I usually say, what's your ancestry? Now, obviously, there is zero research in this at all, but there is research when it comes to lactose persistency, beta carotene, and all these sort of things. So we know it does happen,
Yeah.
even with animal foods and crustaceans. We know it happens. People have sensitivities or don't. We know that it does happen. So if it happens with crustaceans, with dairy, with a whole lot of other things, in general seafood and stuff like that, well, why wouldn't it happen with between ruminant but with land-based animals? Why would they be the exclusion in terms of adaptation? It
Yeah.
never made sense to me.
So what do you think about antigens on in pork are very similar to the antigens that we have in our bodies, for example? Is that all complete bullshit, or does it have any sort of validity?
It's look, as far as a lot of that, I don't think that it's specific because a lot of this sort of thing breaks down in the stomach anyway.
Yeah.
A lot of these things that just are broken down to their very simple constituent parts, and even the receptor sites that we have. Like people talk about things like dairy growth hormones, and I'm going, well, the receptor site's completely different. So even if you were to pump it into your system, bypassing the stomach, it can't actually attach to the receptor site. We're a different species.
Yeah.
So so I don't buy that sort of thing. I think it's more that we've got the ability to process certain foods. It doesn't mean that, somebody who comes from the Northern Europe, never really been exposed to pork, can't eat a small amount of pork and be, fine. But they may not be able to, over a certain threshold, be able to process it as well and feel as well because they just don't have the ability to train to upregulate certain specialized enzymes to be able to deal with the difference composition or things that need to be dealt with. So and there may be other things and other components inside that may be reactive components that we're not aware of or don't know yet. So there's a lot of unknowns, and so this is why I come back to adaptive capacity to certain foods over many generations makes more sense to me why these differences exist.
The fact that I don't really like pork except for bacon, does that have anything to do with my ancestry?
Yes, I would say so. Because you do have some South American heritage on your dad's side, is it?
Yeah, I'm from Scandinavia.
Yeah. So you've got that, and you've probably got some tolerance for pork, but not a higher level, depending on, because your mum would have grown up on ruminants, probably reindeer as well. There'd be a bit of that. There would have been a bit of things like fish as well, seafood, and raw fish,
Oh,
raw
God.
stinky fish as well.
I'm
All
not a
those
good
sort of
I'm
things.
not a good Swede. Just let's put that out there. I don't like any much from the sea. But okay, go on.
Yeah, so all those sort of things. So you would have got some adaptation, but you may have a certain threshold. So you can't produce enough of the sort of enzymes that are required to sort of deal with excessive amount of pork. And it's like some people have a certain level of tolerance to dairy, but not, who've come from a mixed and don't have a very high. So that may explain your mixed heritage, the reason why you have some level of tolerance but not a high level of tolerance, and you can do better with some but not too much. And sort of there are differences between the composition of the aminos and the fatty acids in between bacon and other parts. Not only there's also a bit of a difference with the deuterium, 2 to 3 parts per million difference, but also some of the composition, and that itself may also influence the way how we process in our bodies, enzymatically break things down, and what we do with them and how we utilize things. And there may be also other components that we're unaware of because, there are thousands of components in animal foods, but we don't even know about. because we haven't researched. We know things exist in there, but things haven't been looked at. We haven't researched. We don't really know how they work. The more and more we investigate and we learn about them, we learn that they have a lot of benefits, but also that there could be potentially also some people may not have sufficient adaptations to certain animal foods. So that's the sort of approach that I do take. It's a very different approach than others take in the carnivore space, but I tend to take the approach that I try to push people in the direction of being more in line with their ancestral adaptation than further away from it, and they will do much better.